Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're jumping into some really fascinating, maybe sometimes tricky concepts. Sincerity and authenticity.
Yeah, they seem simple on the surface, don't they? But they've actually shaped so much art, business, how we think about ourselves, how we see other people. It runs deep.
Absolutely. And to help us navigate this, we've gathered, well, quite a stack of sources. The main one is R.J. McGill Jr.'s book, Sincerity, which is really insightful.
But we're also pulling in things like reviews of the book, reader comments, which add some interesting layers, and snippets from other key thinkers McGill discusses.
So our plan, our mission, if you like, is to unpack all this. We want to trace the history of these ideas, see how they pop up in different cultural moments, different figures, and really try to understand why they still matter so much for you right now.
Sounds good. Where should we kick off? The history seems like the place to start.
So, sincerity. Where does this idea really begin to take shape? The literary critic Lionel Trilling, he points us quite a way back.
Right, he talks about the 16th century, doesn't he? Around the 1500s.
He does. Seems quite specific. Why then?
Well, Trilling connects it pretty directly to the Protestant Reformation.
Ah, okay.
Think about that whole shift, less emphasis on the big institutions, the church rituals, and much more focus on your personal conscience, your individual connection to God.
So what's going on inside becomes the crucial thing, not just outward shows.
Exactly, your inner state. And thinking about that era, you also had more travel, more trade happening. People were encountering strangers more often.
So being able to judge if someone was actually being straight with you, if they were sincere, that became a really vital social skill, right?
Definitely, you had to figure people out. But then Trilling makes this interesting move. He argues that later on, sincerity gets sort of superseded, or maybe complicated,
By what?
by authenticity.
Authenticity. Okay, how's that different from sincerity? They sound similar.
Yeah, they do, but Trilling saw authenticity as a more strenuous moral experience. It wasn't just about your inner feelings matching your outer expression.
Okay.
It was, as he put it, sincerity plus autonomy. So there's this added element of asserting yourself, your unique self, maybe even pushing back against social norms or what everyone else thinks you should feel or be.
Right. Sincerity with a kind of individualistic, maybe even defiant edge to it.
That's a good way to put it. Now, McGill, whose book is our main guide here, he gives sincerity a really wide-ranging definition.
How does he define it?
He calls it, let me get this right, confronting one's innermost thoughts or emotions and relaying them to others straightforwardly, no matter how relevant to the topic, injurious to one's own reputation, or embarrassing, or however correct or incorrect.
Whoa. Okay, that sounds potentially like just blurting everything out, like oversharing defiance.
It could sound like that, yeah. But McGill uses this broad scope, I think, to capture a huge variety of experiences he wants to talk about, that fundamental urge to just get the inside out, honestly, for better or worse.
And he sees this impulse playing out really strongly in the arts, doesn't he? Particularly in design.
He does. He argues you can almost read the history of modern design as this ongoing quest for visual sincerity.
How does that work?
Well, think back to what we just said about Protestantism. That emphasis on simplicity, that was partly a reaction against what they saw as the fancy, maybe deceptive ornamentation of Baroque Catholicism.
Ah, so decoration starts to feel dishonest, like it's hiding something.
Kind of, yeah. And McGill traces that impulse forward, arguing it fuels the rise of abstraction in art later on, the whole movement towards the purest possible presentation of material.
Stripping away representation, stripping away ornament,
Yeah,
getting down to just the thing itself.
exactly. Dissembling, pretending to be something else, that becomes suspect, which leads him to someone like Ad Reinhardt.
The black on black paintings.
McGill calls those the apotheosis of sincerity in the arts, the absolute peak.
Really, just black paint on canvas is ultimate sincerity.
Well, that's the argument. They achieved sincerity itself precisely because they weren't pretending. They were just paint on canvas, being themselves, materially speaking. No illusions.
Okay, I can follow the logic. Even if it feels extreme, it's pushing that idea to its limit. But literature seems like a different kettle of fish. McGill points to Rousseau there, right?
Oh, absolutely. Rousseau is kind of ground zero for the modern literary obsession with sincerity.
Oh.
His Confessions, that relentless focus on the self, warts and all.
And that ripples outwards.
Hugely. You see it in German and English Romanticism, American Transcendentalism, French symbolism, this drive to excavate the self, find that unique inner truth, and just show it. flaunt it even.
Stressing your own experience over the commercial and social developments, like the
Uh,
source says.
yeah, that romantic impulse. It carries that echo of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, go forward and leap toward vigilant, violent self-expression.
But then, Freud enters the chat, and he throws a bit of a spanner in the works for that whole naturally good inner self idea, doesn't he?
Yeah. Oh, completely. Freud basically takes that traditional idea, a sort of holy space inside us, where we connect with the divine or our pure nature,
And replaces it
with drives,
Hmm.
primal stuff, sex, violence, death, and pleasure. His view of humanity wasn't Rousseau's naturally good person. Freud saw us as more like the phrase used is homicidal little beast.
Okay, that's
Well,
quite a contrast. And suddenly, that urge for total unvarnished sincerity seems maybe a bit alarming.
right. If that's what's lurking in your innermost thoughts, maybe a little bit of holding back isn't such a bad thing. It definitely gives you a reason to be wary of extreme sincerity.
Yet, despite that darker view, that push against fakeness, against artifice, it still seems to permeate culture.
It does. Even satirists like H.L. Mencken, Dorothy Parker, W.C. Fields, they're constantly mocking phonies and frauds, which, in a way, reinforces the value of sincerity by highlighting its opposite.
McGill also throws in this really interesting kind of meta idea. He suggests maybe our frustration with insincerity isn't entirely, well, sincere itself.
What do you mean?
He calls it itself disingenuous, a kind of performance of upright moral sensibility. Like, we perform outrage at fakeness to show how moral we are.
Huh. That reminds me of the Puritans, actually. So focused on rooting out insincerity that they ended up suspicious and distrustful of pretty much everyone.
Exactly. And brings to mind that Nietzsche quote, "The truly sincere person ends up understanding that he is always lying." It's a real paradox.
The harder you try, the more you realize performance is baked in.
Seems to be the idea. McGill doesn't dismiss sincerity, though. He seems to favor it, ultimately, but with a warning. The dose makes the poison. Too much or the wrong kind can be damaging.
That makes sense. We have a reader comment that brings this right up to the present day, especially for artists dealing with things like AI.
Oh, yeah. What's the angle?
They were saying that authenticity and sincerity become really crucial points of reflection when you're faced with these new technologies. It creates a sort of cognitive dissonance that makes artists question their own intentions more deeply.
How so? Like choosing specific methods.
Exactly. The example given was choosing acoustic instruments or writing out musical scores, things some might see as old-fashioned or even dead forms, but doing it precisely because it feels honest, it feels intentional, compared to potentially automated creative processes.
But there's an irony noted there, too, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. An artist might choose a sincere old-school method, but still be quite detached or hand-off in other ways. It just highlights how complicated pinning down that real self or real process actually is.
It really is. And thinking about artists and sincerity, the critic David Hickey comes up. He's known for a very personal style of criticism.
Right, embracing things others might keep separate, like loving both Andy Warhol and Norman Rockwell with equal passion. He calls it the love of the record collector.
I like that. It's about genuine enthusiasm, not just ticking critical boxes. He has that great quote, "We are always falling in love. That's why we're critics."
It's a kind of sincerity in criticism itself, isn't it? Admitting that subjective passion drives the whole enterprise.
Definitely. Now, circling back to complexity, another reader comment brings up irony again, which feels unavoidable in this discussion.
Yeah, irony looms large. They described it as, on one hand, a numbing response to political and cultural malaise, a way to cope.
The shield.
Right.
Right.
But also, paradoxically, a way of saying things without meaning them, and meaning things without saying them. Almost like poetry, or culture itself, as the comment suggests.
So it could be defensive, but also defiant. A form of defiance born of rage and pain.
Mm-hmm. And the comment points out that the whole post-9/11 hipster thing, with its supposed return to authenticity, now feels like part of a cycle. This dance between sincerity and irony just keeps repeating.
That tension really sharpens when we look at, say, mid-20th century America. Post-war society had huge anxieties about conformity.
Oh, yeah, you had major books tackling that. Galbraith's The Affluent Society, C. Wright Mills's White Collar, and especially David Riesman's The Lonely Crowd.
Riesman's work feels key here. He had those social types. Tradition-directed, inner-directed.
And other-directed. And he saw this huge rise in the other-directed personality after the war, around the late 1940s.
Remind us, what defines the other-directed person?
They primarily look outwards to their peers for cues on how to act and what to value. They tend to have a weaker internal compass, a weaker sense of self.
So they're more concerned with fitting in, being liked.
Yeah, Riesman said they wanted to be loved rather than esteemed, and constantly needed signals that they were emotionally in tune with the group, always scanning the social radar.
Sounds stressful. And Riesman specifically connects this to sincerity, right?
Yeah.
In that section, tolerance and the cult of sincerity.
He does. He argues that this yearning for sincerity became a core part of this other-directed mindset. People started judging things, art, celebrities, politicians, based on how sincere they felt.
So it wasn't about the quality of the singing, say, but whether Dinah Shore or Frank Sinatra seemed authentic.
Pretty much. Aesthetic judgment shifted from the work itself to this subjective feeling about the person performing it.
And Riesman saw this playing out in politics, too. The desire for a sincere candidate, like Eisenhower, was often perceived.
Yes, he saw it as partly a way people tried to escape the cynicism they felt about politics. But he saw a big downside.
Which was?
Well, if everyone's demanding sincerity, it just puts a premium on faking it. Performers, politicians, they'll learn to give the audience the performance of sincerity it wants.
It encourages the very thing it claims to oppose.
Exactly. And maybe more importantly, Riesman argued, focusing just on perceived sincerity means the public can neglect its duty to assess other crucial qualities.
Like intelligence, knowledge, actual honesty, which isn't quite the same as sincerity, decisiveness, effectiveness.
All of those. When the feeling of sincerity becomes the main thing, Riesman felt, it actually becomes a vice. It distracts from substance.
And the source points out, just as an example of this complexity, that someone like Eisenhower, often viewed through that sincere lens, still undertook significant actions, like on civil rights, signing legislation, sending troops to Little Rock. Actions requiring those other qualities Riesman mentioned.
Right. The point isn't about judging Eisenhower, but illustrating Riesman's argument about how a focus on sincerity alone can miss the bigger picture of leadership and action. We're just relaying Riesman's critique here.
Got it. Now, C. Wright Mills, in White Collar, adds another dimension to this post-war picture, focusing on the rise of the white-collar managerial class.
He saw these individuals as deeply internally split, fragmented, very dependent on the corporation externally. The shift away from independent work towards corporate life, he felt, led to this kind of groupthink that stifled individuality.
And yet that chilling phrase, the personality market.
Yeah, where people basically turn themselves into instruments for selling. Professional life demands this kind of insincerity. Kindness and friendliness become aspects of personalized service, not genuine feelings.
So the successful person has to make an instrument of his own appearance and personality. You package yourself for sale.
That's how Mills saw it. He felt this pervasive insincerity was the defining characteristic of 20th century existence, turning everything into society as a great sales room. It's worth noting he saw himself as an outlander, which likely shaped his critical stance.
And then there's Irving Goffman, whose work, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, is so influential, using all that theater language, stage, actors, impression management.
Goffman had these two key types he saw flourishing mid-century, the sincere believer and the cynic. But the really fascinating part is he saw them often existing within the same person.
How does that work?
Well, the social actor, as he called them, might genuinely be sincerely convinced that the impression of reality which he stages is the real reality while they're performing a role.
Like a salesperson really believing in the product while they're selling it?
Kind of. But then later they might step back and disbelieve their own performance. The cynic, Goffman said, has no belief in his own act from the start. The sincere person, however, does believe in the impression fostered by their own performance, at least in the moment.
And Goffman's crucial point was that in the modern economy, you increasingly had to buy into your own performance to get ahead.
Yeah, especially in that growing middle-class managers, salespeople. Selling often involved selling false impressions, and it became easier, maybe necessary, to actually convince yourself first.
And this connects to the rise of suburbia.
Definitely. By 1960, that middle class was huge, 2/3 of the population, many migrating to the suburbs, which became the sort of stage for performing the American dream.
Right, the source mentions that Time magazine cover story, pointing out suburban names like Streamwood or Oak Park, invoking a nature that was often destroyed to build the suburb, yet maintaining this romantic fascination with fake lakes and parks, another layer of performance.
But there was resistance brewing, wasn't there? A counter-narrative.
Oh yeah, you see it powerfully in fiction. Novels like Walker Percy's The Moviegoer or Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road. Characters who feel utterly trapped and alienated inside that supposedly perfect suburban life, desperate for something real.
And sociologists like Arlie Russell Hochschild were looking at emotional labor, how service workers have to perform friendliness, perform care.
Right, the managed heart. Her book about how that forced sincerity on the job can actually start to bleed into your real personality off the clock, the performance takes over.
Which really sets the stage for the 1960s and that whole Age of Aquarius vibe.
Yeah, the image, at least, was all about emotional honesty, being natural, communal living, freedom, be yourself. Kind of Rousseau's dream revisited, maybe. Homemade bread, back to the land stuff.
Definitely that authentic impulse. But at the same time, there was that undercurrent of skepticism we touched on. JFK's 1961 inaugural address with that line, "Sincerity is always subject to proof."
It shows that even as one part of the culture craved raw authenticity, another part was becoming increasingly cynical, wary of motives. Being skeptical was almost becoming a sign of being smart, of being worldly.
It's a real paradox. And as the 60s moved into the early 70s, the counterculture itself started shifting, spreading into the mainstream, but also, maybe, changing its character.
Yeah, you had bands like the Stones or Led Zeppelin who had this raw power, but also projected this image of cool detachment, almost irony, alongside the excess.
And by about 1972, some commentators were saying the fun was over. Michael Harrington's point was that once the mainstream absorbed the counterculture's style, its oppositional power was gone. Warren Hinkle noted that hippies were now selling change, clothes, fun, and getting rich doing it.
Jerry Rubin saw it as the final nail in the coffin for the Protestant ethic. Screw work, we want to know ourselves, which then gets filtered through commerce in bizarre ways, like a TV set covered in blue denim.
The Zenith sidekick, perfect symbol of that kitschy co-option. And Thomas Frank really nailed this in his book, The Conquest of Cool.
His argument wasn't just that business adopted counterculture style, but that it actively created a fake one.
Yeah, he said business dogged the counterculture with a fake counterculture, a commercial replica. Think about all the knockoff bands, the glossy magazine spreads in Life, the TV specials trying to explain hippies.
The ads using the lingo, like the man can't bust our music.
Exactly. Frank points to the San Francisco Diggers, who are about genuinely free sharing, holding a mock funeral for hippie-devoted son of mass media. They saw exactly what was happening.
So hip capitalism, as Frank calls it, basically stole the counterculture's cool, used the whole hip versus square thing to sell products, turning this rebellious style from adversarial to hegemonic.
Pretty much. It became the dominant logic for advertisers and marketers, the cool way to sell anything. Frank's analysis became the standard take for anyone trying to understand that period.
And meanwhile, academics were also digging into Sincerity's history during this time, right? Trilling, Pear, others, asking what happened to Sincerity's moral weight in an era obsessed with liberation and cool.
Right. You had Henri Pear in '63 calling sincerity the most potent ID force, this powerful driving idea. But then, just 10 years later, Trilling finds it's become a problem. Its meaning got murky, its value questionable.
And that reader comment about irony seems relevant again here, it being a numbing response. But also that tricky way of meaning things without saying them directly.
It ties into that other idea the reader mentioned, authenticity feeling like compartmentalization, like a conspiracy where everyone knows everyone's wearing a mask and the game is just learning how to wear yours convincingly.
Which feels like it brings us right up to the present day. That constant tension for artists, creators, wanting to express something genuine, but terrified of seeming naive or being mocked, or having their sincerity dissected as just another performance.
And it's a tightrope walk. Michael Stipe from REM is mentioned as an example, sometimes associated with what one critic called the dull, sincere artist aesthetic.
Is that referring to things like his sculpture? The Newspaper in a Box, my favorite ever edition of the New York Times.
Partly, yeah. And Stipe's own comments about it, insisting on its personal depth, saying, "It is what it is. It's like something I have to get out of me," and claiming sincerity is all I've got.
So the logic becomes, if it's sincerely felt and expressed by the artist, then it is art, and it's valuable because of that sincerity, regardless of anything else.
That seems to be the implication McGill critiques. He labels it the resulting logic of deadbeat romanticism.
Deadbeat romanticism. Ouch.
Yeah, it suggests a kind of watered-down romanticism, all the focus on feeling, but maybe without the rigor, the craft, the broader context. Just sincerity as an end in itself, almost easily achieved.
Okay, contrast that with an artist like Sean Landers. His paintings, like the clown ones, can look incredibly raw, almost painfully sincere.
Right. But then you ask him about purity in art, and he brings up his perineum.
Exactly. There's this immediate undercutting, this awareness of the potential absurdity or pretension. He talks about like peeling an onion, layers of irony, layers of sincerity. He says he's more comfortable with irony, but knows the audience often connects with the sincere bits.
There was that review of his work, Taint Sincerity, that picked up on this. It suggested he tries to seem cool by admitting he's uncool, appearing sincere by confessing faults, sort of like Montaigne, but he never actually uses the word sincere.
And the reviewer drew that line between being genuinely sincere and just being an open book, easy to read, suggesting Landers might be more of an open book trickster,
Using the appearance of sincerity strategically, it's complex.
which maybe reflects what younger artists are wrestling with now, trying to get out from under that constant perma-irony of the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah.
The pop-up video, Tarantino, early Wallace era.
Yeah, there's a sense that maybe that hyper-irony hit a dead end. So the move now is perhaps trying to reclaim sincerity's validity, maybe even by ironically acknowledging the difficulty of being sincere first.
It does feel like there's a pushback, a return of the sincerely expressive self after decades dominated by theory about the death of the author. Artists with real concerns, personal, political, seem to be finding more space again.
Adam Hazlitt, the novelist, observed back in 2011 that postmodern irony just wasn't cutting it anymore for tackling big social issues. It had been completely absorbed by marketing, used to sell nostalgia, Katy Perry aesthetics, E-Team remakes, that kind of thing.
It lost its bite. Which brings us back to David Foster Wallace. His 1993 essay, E Unibus Plurum, is just so prescient about the effects of TV irony.
Absolutely brilliant. He talked about how watching TV trained us to see people looking natural by being intensely self-aware, that self-conscious appearance of unself-consciousness.
TV's big illusion, both medicine and poison, he called it.
And he nailed how a lot of the pleasure in watching TV became about mocking it, developing this ironic stance towards everything on screen.
Which then bleeds into real life, making genuine sincerity and passion seem kind of uncool, naive, out TV-wise.
Wallace saw this constant irony and ridicule, even off-screen, as ultimately damaging agents of a great despair and stasis in U.S. culture, a way to just express contempt without engaging.
And he was already tired of it back in '93. He felt irony had become reflexive, tyrannical, losing its power to actually critique anything meaningful. Its constant use just implied, how totally banal of you to ask what I really mean.
It shut down real connection. His hope, famously, was for a new kind of anti-rebel.
People willing to risk looking uncool, to risk the yawn, the rolled eyes, the cool smile.
Exactly. People willing to be earnest, unembarrassed, even in a culture saturated with irony. He wanted us to be able to put down the wink for a little while.
That makes me think of Jonathan Franzen's essay where he isolates himself with Wallace's ashes and Robinson Crusoe. Seeing that old romantic isolation trope as somehow newly relevant, a curative, even while admitting he missed his creature comforts. That same push-pull.
Yeah, that search for something real amidst modern complexities. And you see this tension reflected in trends like the whole hipster phenomenon. That term hip-affected earnestness came up at a 2009 conference.
Right, discussing the whole aesthetic, the trucker hats, the PBR, the skinny jeans, things that could be read as simultaneously ironic and sincerely searching for authenticity.
An audience member there apparently said hipsters felt permanently and obsessively committed to being for real, seeing themselves as the truly authentic ones.
And you hear this same struggle in music today. Justin Vernon, Bon Iver talking about not wanting to reveal the mysteries of this deep plumbing of the self in public without seeming cheesy.
That struggle itself becomes almost a marker of sincerity, doesn't it? The difficulty in articulating it proves its power. He emphasizes the honesty of his record over production quality.
Yeah, comparing it to Dylan's New Morning, not well produced, but honest. Sincerity is the highest value.
Then you have that interview with The Pains of Being Pure at Heart. They say their name is very emotionally sincere.
And the interviewer pushes back, earnest, on purpose.
Right. And the singer insists, no, it's about trying to speak genuine, say something sincere and good, while kind of conceding the point about calculation. He maintains they are sincere, not just performing it.
Which leads to that great punchline from the interviewer. My friends would have kicked your ass. Perfectly capturing the social risk, the pains of being genuinely earnest or pure at heart in a skeptical world.
And Beck offers yet another perspective in that spin interview. Sincerity is the new irony. He sort of shrugs off the need to choose.
He champions ambiguity.
Yeah, mixed responses. He thinks this whole authenticity, sincerity obsession is maybe a particularly American thing. His own heroes, he says, were always a mix, sometimes heartfelt, sometimes fairly goofy.
Maybe the answer isn't choosing one or the other, sincerity or irony, but finding a way to hold both or move between them.
Perhaps. And interestingly, the source notes a parallel trend. Just as neo-folk music nods stylistically to the countryside, there's also been a real resurgence in people actually wanting to move to the countryside.
Seeking an authentic place to match the search for an authentic self.
Could be. It all ties together.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered some ground here. We went from the historical roots of sincerity back in the Reformation.
Watched it morph into that more demanding idea of authenticity.
Saw how both shaped art and design, sometimes in surprising ways.
Then traced how these ideas got tangled up with conformity, the post-war anxieties, the rise of the personality market.
The counterculture's push for sincerity, and then how commerce and irony sort of co-opted that.
Right up to the present day, with artists and, well, all of us still navigating this complex dance between wanting to be real and knowing that presentation always involves some level of performance.
It really shows how these concepts, sincerity and authenticity, they're not just abstract. They deeply shape how we understand creativity, how we interact socially, even how we judge our leaders.
Definitely. It's woven into the fabric of how we see the world.
So here's something to leave you with, something to maybe mull over. Given everything we've discussed, the idea that sincerity can be performed, that maybe pure authenticity is an illusion, that irony is this constant companion. How does that change how you think about genuine expression, both in yourself and when you encounter it from others? Is it possible, do you think, to be sincere today without also maybe acknowledging the performance involved, without that little wink to the audience?
Is there a way to be earnest without irony lurking? Or is navigating that tension the only truly authentic path now? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about.